Well, in a significant diplomatic shift, the U.S. and Russia have agreed to start working toward ending the war in Ukraine and improving relations between themselves.
President Trump is committed to bringing an end to this conflict, and he wants it to end in a way that's fair. He wants it to end in a way that's sustainable and enduring, not that leads to another conflict in 2 to 3 years. That's not going to be easy to achieve. In order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by all sides. We're not going to predetermine what those are.
The talks are among the first high-level in-person discussions between Russia and the U.S. and U.S. officials, but there is a pivotal player missing from the Ukrainian peace talks: Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said today he would not accept any decision made without Ukraine at the bargaining table. Moments ago, U.S. President Donald Trump defended this style of negotiation.
I think I have the power to end this war, and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way.
Tjorven Bellmann is Germany's ambassador to Canada. She joins me now. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
These talks between Russia and the United States that exclude Ukraine, how much do they worry you?
Well, our politicians, the Chancellor and the Foreign Minister, have been very clear that we believe talks about Ukraine should be with the Ukrainians at the table, as well as talks about European security have to be with the Europeans at the table.
Donald Trump made the case just moments ago in a news conference he had that if Ukraine was worried about not having a seat at the table, well, frankly, they could have had a deal a long time ago. He suggests very little land would have had to have been given up. What do you say to that analysis of this situation?
I think from our point of view, Ukraine was attacked by their neighbor, Russia, in a war of aggression and a full-scale invasion that was unprovoked, and that Russia could stop this war any moment. President Putin could stop this war any moment if he intended to do so seriously. So we don't see a serious intention on the Russian side to come to the table and really be serious about talks. What we see at the moment is maximalist positions.
So when you say you do not see an intention to be serious about this, what then should we understand is your interpretation or Germany's interpretation of what is happening in these conversations between the United States and Russia? Does that suggest that those conversations, despite the fact that the participants are talking about this as a path towards peace, are not serious?
I think what we saw is a first round of talks between both sides, which hopefully gives the American side a clearer picture of where the Russian position is right now. But again, we've been very clear that if there is to be a negotiation for a peace that is really to be a peace that lasts and that ends this war and doesn't prepare the next round of conflict, the Ukrainians have to be part of that conversation.
Does it make sense to you? Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio talked about these conversations as, work towards a peace settlement, but also that they wanted to explore, quote, the incredible opportunities that exist to partner with the Russians, both geopolitically and economically, that those two conversations would be happening at the same time. How do you interpret that?
Well, I think it's up to the American side to define what their relationship with Russia is supposed to be in the future. I mean, we, from a European and German perspective, very clearly see a Russia at the moment that is conducting a malign interference campaign in Europe and against our security in Germany, against European security, a campaign that encompasses sabotage. We've seen murder in the past. We see a lot of disinformation. So from our point of view, we don't see any reason to reshape our relationship with Russia at the moment. If Russia wants to be back at the table, it has to behave according to the standards and rules of international law.
European leaders did hold their own summit in Paris. What would you say the takeaway is from that? It's obviously an effort to counterbalance these talks, but there is disagreement amongst Europeans about the path forward.
There are different opinions, that's true. The German government has made very clear that before we want to talk about any element of a possible future settlement to the conflict in Ukraine, we have to have a negotiation where the parties that are concerned are sitting at the table, and that it's premature to to speculate about individual elements of such a settlement before we even know what we are talking about. But I think the meeting was useful, an exchange that sort of saw agreement on factors such as nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine at the table, nothing on European security without the Europeans at the table, and that we are determined to continue to support Ukraine into the future.
What evidence do you see that there is a path forward like the one you are aspiring to, where everybody gets around the same table?
I think we've heard voices today from the U.S. administration that recognize that Europe at one point has to be at the table as well as the Ukrainians. We hope certainly that this will be the case sooner rather than later.
Particularly the comments that the United States is making about it being unrealistic for Ukraine to return to its international borders. How do you believe the international community ought to respond to that?
In the end, it's for the Ukrainians to decide what kind of settlement they can sign up to. Whether territorial concessions will be part of that settlement is a question that has to be left to these negotiations. It's a known fact that at the moment part of Ukraine is under Russian occupation. But there are other elements that have to be part of the equation as well. Security guarantees, Ukrainian armed forces that are able to defend Ukraine in the future, respect for Ukrainian sovereignty, etc.
You talk about security guarantees. Keir Starmer of the UK has said that his country would be willing to put troops on the border to ensure security guarantees. The sense that that conversation is premature. Help me understand why that is the German reaction.
Because the different elements have to be part of the whole and overall picture, and we can only talk about these things when we sit at the table. And it's been good practice in our Euro-Atlantic security architecture that we have, that Europe and North America have shared the burden of security. So first things first we have to have a negotiation where all parties concerned sit at the table, and then we can discuss about elements of such an arrangement. But again, it has to be in the end a Ukrainian decision first and foremost, what kind of elements they think they can agree to and what not.
Canada has expressed an aspiration to be involved in some of these conversations going forward, to perhaps play a role. Where do you think Canada might fit in?
From my point of view, it's important that Canada is part of the conversations at the table. Canada is an important ally with high engagement in the Ukraine file throughout and a great supporter of Ukrainian sovereignty and independence. So we would certainly welcome that. The same holds true for any conversation of future Euro-Atlantic security architecture, in which Canada is an important player as well.
The one thing I find myself wanting to know, but I appreciate this is a difficult question for a diplomat. I mean, this is obviously a moment of such great change and flux. We think of J.D. Vance's comments at the Munich Security Forum about saying the threat isn't from Russia, it's from within. If you were to pull back a bit, as someone who has spent so much of her career observing international affairs, what piece of wisdom or information would you impart to folks about how to think about this moment of such great churn and change?
I agree, and I think you've seen this in the conversations in Munich, around Munich, the reactions to this, that we are in uncharted territory and we are at a crossroads. We still believe that the U.S. are our most important ally. We need to sustain and continue to build this relationship. But it's also true that all of us need to be able to bring more to the table and invest more in our security and defense. We certainly hope that the architecture we've seen with NATO, the most successful defense alliance in these past decades, continues to be as successful as we have been. It's important we are having these conversations with the new U.S. administration, but it's clearly also a moment where we Europeans and Canada have to strengthen our relationship and see to it that we know where our friends are.
In that very vein, many Canadians are asking themselves right now, with this pressure from Donald Trump, where are our friends? Why are they not being more vocal about some of the pressure that Canada is facing? What does Germany say to Donald Trump's suggestion that Canada could become the 51st state?
Well, I would say very clearly that can only happen if the Canadians would say yes to that. And I think the reaction in the country has been very clear that there is no intent to become the 51st state. Our government has been clear, and the Chancellor has been clear, that no borders must be moved by force, and that territorial integrity is a fundamental principle of international law, and that applies to everyone. And we've also been very clear that we don't believe trade wars or tariffs on a war of tariffs does help anybody. We want our citizens to have more money in their pockets, and we know that tariffs have the effect to the opposite.
I guess that could be understood two ways, though, that a tariff war won't help anybody. Certainly it can be understood as Donald Trump, don't go ahead with these tariffs, but a tariff war would potentially involve tariffs and counter tariffs between Canada and the United States. And I wonder, could Canada expect, what kind of support would Canada be able to expect from Germany if such a thing were to happen, be it in the form of diplomatic support or any sort of, I suppose, economic support? I'm talking about increased trade or perhaps some sort of retaliatory move.
Well, in terms of tariffs and countermeasures, I think that's sort of between the countries that are affected by those. So should the U.S. decide on tariffs against the European Union, we would certainly react, and we don't want this to happen, and we want to have a positive trade relationship. But European politicians and the European Commission and German politicians have made very clear that should the U.S. decide on such a step, the European Union would react, as much as Canada has made this clear very publicly and has laid out what the countermeasures would be. So in that, I think we are aligned. With regard to our bilateral trade between the EU and Canada, we believe there is still potential to increase that. We want to be part of the solution. Should Canada decide to diversify trade, CETA has increased trade between Europe and Canada to a substantial amount, and we hope that this could be made even bigger in the future.
So this fundamental question, who has our back? What is Germany's answer?
Europe has your back.
Thank you for your time today, Ambassador.
You're welcome.